The historical context to the New Testament, Part 1. In order to understand the Gospels, you must be fluent in the Old Testament. All those references to Abraham, Moses, the law, the significance of the temple. The author assumes the reader is familiar with all these things, and we learn about them in the Old Testament. But there are other New Testament terms too, like Sanhedrin, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Zealots, which are not explained in the Old Testament. Things we are forced to look up. The goal of this video is to show you where these terms came from. The Protestant Old Testament ends with the exiles returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. The prophet Malachi helps us interpret these events. Then, on the next page, we have the birth of Jesus, and this, according to John 2, happened in the days of Caesar Augustus, when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. But where did the Romans come from, and what happened to the Persians? And what about the Greeks? One of Jesus' apostles was called a zealot. Two of them had Greek names. And the New Testament is written in Greek. More differences. Nehemiah controlled only a small area in Judea, but Jesus lived far north in Galilee. In the Gospels, especially in John, we recognize a tension between the Galileans and the Judeans. And who is this bad King Herod? And how many Herods are there? The only thing all these groups seem to have in common is mutual suspicion. Where did that all come from? Catholic Bibles get us halfway to the answer: the Maccabees. They fought the successors of Alexander the Great, the Seleucids. Between the Maccabees and the New Testament are the Hasmoneans. The origin of the Hasmoneans is easy to find. They are descendants of Simon Thassi. But what about the Herods? Where did they come from? Are they family or foreign usurpers? Both. More on that later. These rulers fought against a foreign power. They grew the kingdom. John Hyrcanus pushed both north and south. Make a note of that, because we've made it to Galilee, Jesus' future hometown, and that's one term off our list. But more land means more contact with nations like the Nabateans and the Parthians, and Rome. Rome is why Hyrcanus too was restored to power. And Rome's fight with Parthia will end up with Herod on the throne. You guys fought, but you also cooperated. What? Maccabees and Greeks fighting on the same side? Well, if you don't believe me, take a look at 1 Maccabees chapter 10 and chapter 15. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The Seleucids were constantly in a state of civil war. Statecraft involves playing one side off the other so that you have room to breathe. Greece fades. Rome is on the rise. Zoom out and we notice a gap longer than the entire Hasmonean Dynasty. So who ruled at this time? The Great Assembly, a precursor of the Sanhedrin, which is our second term. And I'm not saying the Great Assembly and the Great Sanhedrin were the same thing. Different centuries, different rules, different members. Still, there was a precedent to a type of Jewish Senate making laws and ruling on criminal cases. And at this time, Jerusalem did not need and probably did not want a local tyrant. As long as they maintained good relationships with Persia and then with Greece, as long as they paid their taxes, the empire would provide security, not out of kindness, but for the sake of internal stability. Anyway, this gap could be a sign of relative peace, if not independence. In any case, all the rulers on this list will have to deal in some way with the Sanhedrin. Enough about the rulers, though. What about the priesthood? We can trace this line all the way back to Zadok, who is the priest Solomon installed in his first temple. And Zadok is where we get our next term, Sadducees. If Zadok was installed, someone else must have been uninstalled. And this is not a minor detail. It is a major shift of priestly lines from one son of Aaron to another, which matters to our story because the Maccabees are over here. Let's get back to them. And there they are, and there too, which might be a problem. And this Alcimus, he was installed by the same Seleucid general after he was finally able to kill Judas Maccabeus. If some cooperation with the Greeks is understandable, this is clearly too much. And by Greece, we mean more than just a military force, but we mean ideas and culture, Hellenization. Are we okay with this? Well, maybe a little. Why not? Say the Sadducees, the priesthood is hereditary and we need to survive here. No, say the Pharisees. What matters is purity, purity of doctrine and practice. You can find other lists of differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in terms of theology, wealth, rural versus urban, but these can all be traced back to different approaches to Hellenization. Notice how this plays out in Matthew 22. The Sadducees question Jesus. They use a logic puzzle with marriage and the resurrection. They try to make it seem logically ridiculous. Next, the Pharisees want Jesus to debate the law. Law, not logic, is their specialty. Pharisees question Jesus on divorce, taxation, fasting, washing, on the Sabbath. They criticize him for associating with sinners. These are not just abstract issues. Alexander supported the Sadducees, but then he found himself in conflict with the Pharisees. And by conflict, I mean he had thousands of Pharisees killed in the temple. That land he conquered became the stage for a civil war. The Pharisees up north looked for help from the Seleucids, but when the revolt failed, hundreds more were killed, crucified in the temple in the 1st century BC. Time to take a closer look at the Hasmoneans. These lines show the succession of rulers and of high priests. They have everything you'd want in a dynasty. Fathers, mothers, siblings, a powerful queen, uncreative names. We have an Alexander marrying an Alexandra twice. Here, it's a marriage of cousins. There, it was between in-laws because she married him first. And this is a third marriage to keep track of. And this is another civil war. Who won? Ultimately, Herod the Great. Remember when I told you about this guy expanding the kingdom south? He forcibly converted the population of Edom, and that included the parents of Antipater the Idumean, who engineered a path for his son to be crowned king of the Jews. They exploited divisions like those between the Pharisees and Sadducees. And yeah, that guy switched sides. Hyrcanus too is out of power. Antipater puts him back in, aided first by the Nabateans and then by the Romans and the Pharisees. When the temple is conquered, Antipater becomes the power behind the throne, influential enough to arrange a royal marriage for his son Herod. First, raise your hand if you imprisoned somebody else on this chart, or had them killed. Yikes, and Herod is just getting started, but we're trying to finish our list. We've met Herod. Now tell us more about the Romans. Okay, here's a memorable story. It begins with priest Onias III, who enjoys a good relationship with both the local population and the Greeks. And by good, I mean the treasury is full. Jason, Onias' brother, wants the office and the money. To get it, he bribes Antigonus IV. The Greeks have been around for centuries, but Antigonus is a Seleucid. They're new. His father just conquered the area a few decades ago. Jason Hellenizes the city, sets up a gymnasium. Then someone from another family, Menelaus, outbids Jason and is installed as priest. Antiochus doesn't really care. He has his own plans. Like his father, he invades Egypt, but on his way there, he is stopped by a Roman ambassador named Gaius Popilius. Antigonus reaches out his hand in friendship, but the Roman tells him that any move against Egypt will mean war with Rome. Turn your army around now. Well, Antigonus says he'll have to think about that, and the historian Livy tells us what happens next. Popilius, stern and imperious as ever, drew a circle around the king with the stick he was carrying and said, "Before you step out of this circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate." For a few moments he, Antigonus, hesitated, astounded by such a peremptory order, and at last replied, "I will do what the Senate thinks right." Not till then did Popilius extend his hand to the king as a friend and an ally. Antigonus evacuated Egypt. He is humiliated, and worse, he needs to pay his army. Jason thought this would be a good time to regain the temple. That's another insult to Antigonus. He responds by sacking Jerusalem, robbing the temple, and then, considering it no longer worth the trouble, he turned it into a pagan shrine. You know what happens next, Judas Maccabeus and Hanukkah. But I mention this to show that Antigonus had motivations for defiling the temple. It wasn't just because he was evil. And then the story gets more complicated. Onias and Jason were from the line of Zadok. Judas, as we already mentioned, were from the other side of Aaron's family. Menelaus, sources differ on this, but we'll say that Menelaus was from the tribe of Benjamin. So who should be high priest? The candidate with the purest lineage or the most zeal? Or is this just an office to be bought and sold like any other? Good question, but we're trying to focus on the Romans. Now, they did not intercede out of any special love for the Egyptians. They were looking for a fight, and the best way to start a fight is to walk into a situation where you don't belong and ally yourself with the weaker side. Think about that. In the next century, Rome shows up again. Pompey invades in 63 BC. We, meaning Antipater, have met him already. But 10 years later, Crassus, another Roman, pushes the army further east and is destroyed by the Parthians. That empire now expands. And for this Antigonus, Parthian victory means a chance to avenge his father and seize the throne. Rome strikes back, and it has an obvious choice for who will oversee the siege and maintain the peace afterwards. A strong man whose marriage gave him legitimacy. If his father could conquer Jerusalem on behalf of Pompey, Herod will be able to do it for Mark Antony. But who is he, and how legitimate is his claim to the throne? Back to our list. Herod, under Hyrcanus II, got his start in Galilee. His heavy-handed tactics brought him before the Sanhedrin, but Herod mocked their authority. Still, even enemies can be useful. Herod will later manipulate the Sanhedrin into convicting and executing his wife. The Greek view of a truth-seeking assembly is replaced with Roman power politics. And Pharisees in the Sanhedrin are not happy about this, and they're not happy with Herod's lifestyle either, his 10 wives. But Herod did take their side in the civil war, so there's that. And the Sadducees, remember? But they also see Herod's building projects. He's expanding the temple. He's making it a center for trade and finance, which they're kind of okay with. Whoever Herod is, he is good for business. If we could work with the Greeks, we can work with the Romans too. Our last group, though, the Zealots, disagree. 100 years later, they will rise up in an attempt to rid Israel of all Roman influence, and the temple will be leveled again. That's the story for part 2.